Hello viewers, this is Dr. Athar Mansoor from Tracks. So recently we came across this phenomenon where US is trying to coerce and pressurize others through economic sanctions, and it's not a recent phenomena as such. US has been doing it for a long period of time, but this we see that this is again now being practiced or followed in a very I would say kind of a vigorous style now, and this seems to be something which is a preferred mode of public policy there in the US domestic circle, where they are trying to impose it internationally, because it's first the domestic actors have to buy it, and then they have to go to the international arena to implement this kind of economic policy. Economists, they generally argue that there are always limits to economic pressures which a country in the international arena can exert on other states. And they also argue that these coercive measures often fail. For the discussion and for delving deeper into these phenomena, where we are going to dissect that how these economic pressures have limits, and how and why they are regarded as coercive measures, and they often do not bring the results which even the country which is trying to impose it through its coercive measures is trying to bring to the world as such, and to its home country. So for today's discussion, I have invited Haider. Haider, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Doctor. How are you?
Right. So Haider, you recently wrote an article in the Friday Times also on the same topic. I'm not going to ask you to summarize that article for the viewers, but I'm going to start with a very basic question. Because you see, we are going to start from the very foundational level so that the viewers understand the whole phenomena. Common man's language. Explain what economic sanctions are.
Sure. Before I define or explain what economic sanctions are, let me give a caution that all of us at one point or the other have sort of faced economic sanctions. How economic sanctions we faced growing up when we were kids, when we were young, I'm sure at one point our father or our mother told us that, hey, if you don't do your homework on time, you will not get that extra pocket money. Hey, if you are not going to the school tomorrow, you will not get this for dinner tonight. So every one of us have at one point or the other faced one form or the other of economic sanctions. What are economic sanctions? So economic sanctions, this is a two-word phrase, economics and sanctions. Sanctions basically means to restrict something. So economic sanctions means to restrict something economically. Now, in terms of international relations, this concept applies to basically economic sanctions are restrictions imposed by one country, an international body, or perhaps a group of countries on one particular country, an international organization, or an individual. So an entity, a country, or a body can impose economic sanctions on another individual, country, or a group of countries. What are these sanctions? So these can take different forms. This can look like complete ban, like country A can say that we will not trade with country B anymore, or this could be just increased tariffs or embargoes, that we will not import, let's say, cars from these countries. We will not do, and just like with countries, they can do the same with an organization. That, for example, country A can decide that we will not deal with an organization X from that country, or we will not deal with an individual X from that country. We've seen the concept of economic sanctions is not novel, it's not new. It, I would argue, has been there since before Christ. If we recall the Peloponnesian Wars, the reason why Peloponnesian Wars happened was because of economic sanctions imposed by Athens on Megra. So economic sanctions have been there since trade has been there. So it's not a new concept. It's just that it has been, as you pointed out, a recent sort of weaponized by policy circles in the US to sort of coerce or force a country to do a certain thing or not. While I've sort of broken down what economic sanctions are, I also think that it's important to refer to the actual formal definition of U.S. sanctions, economic sanctions, and we can go to the U.S. Treasury to understand what they say. So the U.S. Treasury says that economic sanctions are, and I quote, the withdrawal of customary trade and financial relations for foreign and security policy purposes. So just withdrawing trade, withdrawing economic relations for their security or policy purposes. This is a breakdown of what economic sanctions are.
Right. Haider, I think, yes, I also agree with you that these are not new phenomena, and as I have also tried to, but you have delved deeper into it and explained that how they have been used throughout history. But recently we see that especially during Trump 1.0 and now Trump 2.0, and we have discussed this on also in our how Trump has hit hard on countries like Canada, which have been traditionally great friends of United States of America, and they don't have any. And as Trudeau also held a press conference where he tried to, through data and through statistics, try to explain that the border between US and Canada is not as dangerous as portrayed by Mr. Trump, and the illegal fentanyl and other, immigrants, they are not so high that a 25% tariff should be imposed on Canada. Anyways, so economic sanctions, viewers, can take the shape of tariffs, or maybe, a country putting some aid into another country and stopping that aid, or maybe a country traditionally helping some country because it's a developing country and the richer country or advanced country wants to send some money or some assistance to another country, and then it stops to make that country, which was the recipient, understand that if you don't follow our instructions or directions, we are going to cut the supply of essential financial capital or other, maybe anything, or maybe goods or services which are being flowing to you, so that it can hurt you in terms of socio-economic advancement or anything, progress in terms of social progress or economic progress. Anyways, thank you, Athar, for, I guess you want to say
I just
something?
want to add something. Yes, so it's also a form of a formal form of coercion in international law as well. We know that if we have the international body called United Nations, and within that body we have United Nations Security Council. And whenever Security Council passes a resolution, the highest form of coercion could be just sending military boots on ground. If a country A is not agreeing upon doing something, country B can send their boots on ground, make country B on gunpoint do something what they want to do. But on the second level, it's the economic sanctions, in Article 7 and Chapter 7 and Article 41 of the UN Charter clearly sort of says that UN economic sanctions can be imposed on a country to make that country do something or the other.
Right. Okay. This brings me to the second question, Haider, which is that throughout history, the United States has been using economic sanctions. I mean to say, since the US has become powerful in terms of wealth, in terms of money, in terms of productivity, and it has been using the economic sanctions as a tool of its foreign policy to influence global affairs. And can you provide the viewers a historical perspective or overview of all the major economic sanctions imposed by the US, detailing the reasons behind them and assessing whether they were successful or not? Because my initial opening was in my intro to the topic or this video, I tried to explain that economists also argue that these coercive measures do not bring the results for the intentional results, so-called intentional results, for which the powerful try to influence or coerce the powerless or the weaker nations or countries.
Yes, it's important to reflect back and sort of see when and where and why US economic sanctions were imposed and were they successful or not. So if we look if you look back, we can get a good idea if they did work or not. So if you go back to the 1960s, we know that Fidel Castro was aligned with USSR, and US at the time was not happy with Cuba for Fidel Castro's alignment with the USSR, and US imposed economic sanctions on Cuba in 1960s. But till date, we know that US and Cuba US was not able to convince Cuba to go in their bloc. Cuba was aligned with USSR and is still not an American ally. So in the 60s, economic sanctions the US didn't really work at the time. Then we see that moving ahead, they imposed sanctions on Iraq back in the 90s when in the 90s when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and
that was, I think, the first war, right?
Yes. So that was the initial response of the US, that will impose the economic sanctions and push Iraq to pull out of Kuwait. But it wasn't the economic sanctions that really worked. They had to sort of invade Iraq and stop them for going into Kuwait. So at the time, economic sanctions didn't really stop the Gulf War either at the time. And then we saw in the 90s, in the same 97, the US imposed sanctions on Myanmar, Libya, Sudan, all these countries, putting economic sanctions so that they become democratic. Today, we know Sudan is not very democratic. Myanmar, we know it's not very democratic. There's a military dictator there. And they imposed sanctions on Belarus, Venezuela in 21st century, early 2000s. Didn't really work. They're still not very democratic. So US tried to put economic sanctions to make these countries democratic, but it kept backfiring. And we'll go into the reasons as to why it backfired. But some prominent economic sanctions that we've all seen in the news and they didn't seem really to work were we see that US imposed sanctions on North Korea, DPRK, since 50s and 60s when they first started their nuclear program, and they tried to push them towards the nuclear proliferation treaties, tried to prevent them from building their nukes. But what's here? Pyongyang still was able to build nuclear weapons. The strongest economy in the world could not use their strongest economic tool to pressurize the North Koreans. We saw that US put economic sanctions on Russia when it invaded Crimea in 2014. Is Crimea back to Ukraine? No, Russia decided to further annex and invade in Ukraine just 3-4 years ago. So didn't really work at that time either. If we look domestically in Pakistan, in 1998, Nawaz Sharif, and I go in detail in my article as well, that we see Americans call Nawaz Sharif and give not just threat sanctions, but also give economic incentives. But what happened? Successful nuclear weapons, and today Pakistan, outside of P5 countries, Pakistan has the most nuclear weapons in the world. So didn't really work at that time as well. And I can go on and sort of give more options, but most of these economic sanctions didn't really work. If I were to give one example as to where they did work, was perhaps South Africa. When there was an apartheid regime in South Africa, US imposed economic sanctions on South Africa to reverse that apartheid regime. But let me also point out that it was not just American economic sanctions. It was there was a global consensus, which was a global sort of isolation for South Africa, pressure. Even Pakistan was putting pressure on South Africa to let go of the apartheid regime, and that's when they sort of let go. And there was a domestic wave as well. So it was not just economic sanctions that led the reversal of apartheid regime in South Africa, but a global sort of pressure and domestic pressure that let go. To summarize, most of these economic sanctions historically have seemed to not work, if not backfired.
Right. Thank you, Haider. I think you in a very elaborate manner have explained instances in history where US economic sanctions did not work, and I think it's important to understand. Anyways, going to the next question. why do you think these economic sanctions don't work? And what are your central arguments in the article which you just published?
Exactly. So we just outlined we listed a half dozen examples as to US trying to impose sanctions, but they seem to backfire. So the question is, why do these seem to backfire? Why are they not working? In my article, I give 5 reasons as to why these economic sanctions don't seem to work. My first argument as to why these economic sanctions seem to backfire is, number one, nationalism. One thing that economics don't really seem to... So economics just go at invisible hand, what Adam Smith says, that there's, 1 + 1 = 2. They're very quantitative, and they undermine the qualitative sense of economic sanctions. They don't focus on nationalism, how nationalism can play a role. So nationalism is one reason as to why economic sanctions don't work and rather backfire. And we look at the example of Iran, when in 1979 US imposed sanctions on Iran. But what did Iran do? They sort of stir that nationalist spirit within the nation and actually consolidate power. The Khomeini regime sort of gained more power. They played what, if I call it, a victim card, that they portrayed America as a devil, as an imperial power trying to subdue their nation, and as a result stir the spirit of nationalism. So nationalism is one reason why this, and we saw, various countries, even North Korea, used propaganda to sort of stir their nation against the US, that, hey, we are a nation, we're strong, economic sanctions cannot stop us. Nationalism is one. Second thing, and this comes from a more realist international perspective, is that every nation sees their strategic interest over their economic interest. Their long-term strategy of national security is often outweighing the economic short-term goals. They'd rather lose 10, 20, $30 billion, but achieve long-term strategic interest. To give an example, in 1998, Pakistan let go of those $1 billion, sacrificed on their economy, but they realized that they do need nuclear weapons to counter the Indian nuclear weapons, and their strategic interest far superior than their economic interest. Pakistan thought that we lose $20 billion, $30, $100 billion, but we'll rather have these nuclear weapons to defend our strategy. So that's strategic interest is the second argument that I discuss in the article. And third, and this I argue is a new reason as to why economic sanctions are not working, is that now we're moving from a unipolar sort of world order to a multipolar world order. We're seeing that where it was only one country with huge economic power to now multiple regions and countries with significant economic power. So the third reason why...
But especially in the Eastern Hemisphere.
Especially in the East.
Yeah, with the rise of India and China. Right.
With the rise of India and China. So the third argument is that we now have alternate economic lifelines. Why is Canada and Mexico why is Canada so bold with the 25% tariffs? Because Canada knows there's an alternate economic lifeline in form of China/EU. Why is Iran or other countries in the East sort of staring back to the US? Why are they staring back into the eyes of Donald Trump? Because they know there's China, there's Russia, there's other economic powers rising, which will be sort of an alternate economic lifeline. And in case of North Korea, we see that Beijing literally gives financial aid to Pyongyang. They will continue to invest in their infrastructure, continue to invest in their economy while US has imposed sanctions. So, doesn't work. Fourth argument that I give is that economic sanctions are never airtight. Economic sanctions are never, they're not complete and absolute. There's the concept of black markets, and there's the concept of international sort of breaking the rules and going around. And North Korea has done that a lot. Iran has done that a lot. There's North Korean companies registered not under North Korean name and still sort of trading. So it's not, these economic sanctions are not really airtight and cannot completely force. The fifth and the final argument that I give as to why economic sanctions don't entirely work is that they often lack global consensus. They're often unilaterally posed by one economy or one country and do not have a global consensus. So once you don't have a global consensus, there's always leeways around and possibilities of trade and breaking the economic sanctions. So these are the 5 broad reasons why economic sanctions don't seem to work.
I think, Haider, the last one is the most important. When you take decisions rather unilaterally, the repercussions or the outcomes of those decisions in the world order, they would not bring the results which you expect. Even if because we were until recently we were operating in a unipolar world, right? And as now as we have mentioned, that the rise of powers, economic powers, and also military in the East, especially China and India, they have shifted the balance. They have tilted the balance now, and we are moving into a multipolar world, not even a bipolar, but a multipolar world. And these unilateral decisions, whether they are military interventions, and political interventions or economic interventions, they are not going to bring the results unless you develop a consensus for influencing some countries or a group of countries or a single country which you think is involved in a deviant behavior. You need to understand that it's the world which should be driven by multilateralism, and unilateralism will not bring the. Anyways, viewers, this brings us toward the end of this video. The major crux of today's discussion leads to a very pertinent question, and that question is, does liberal economic order has a future? We are going to discuss this question in detail in one of our upcoming videos, so stay tuned for more. Subscribe to our channel, join Tracks.